Hello everyone, and welcome to the 17th in our ongoing series of lectures on Middle Egyptian and hieroglyphics. Today, we will be covering various forms of negation and a couple of notes on the stative that were not covered in Chapter 8, that are part of Chapter 9. So first of all, quick update on the general direction of the channel moving forward and all that. I am going to be getting my doctorate in Egyptology starting in August. Which is, for those of you who don't know, it's going to be like a 5-year full-time process. That's going to also deprive me of a lot of my free time, which means it's the end of these lectures for now. But it also means that in the future, once I start teaching, I will be, of course, giving lectures, presumably recording them for class purposes, accessibility, and all that. And assuming I have permission to do so, I will post as many of them as I can on here. So this will continue to be a channel for Egyptian language and history. It's just that this format of lecture will eventually go away and be replaced by something a little more like a recorded class. My hope is to get through chapter 12 or 13 of Hoke's textbook before then. I'm certain we'll get through 9 and 10, and I'd love to get to like chapter 12-ish. That's also, kind of coincidentally, about the point that I feel comfortable teaching up to. After that, starts to get a little iffier of my understanding of the language, and I would not want to cause confusion. Overview just for this lecture. This is the better part of Chapter 9 in Hoke. There's a few other things that we're not going to cover here that will be put into a wrap-up video. Regarding like certain, I think like possessive adjectives. This is going to cover the negation of nouns and verbs. Basically, most, not all, but most of the ways you can say no in Egyptian, or not, etc. And just a couple of little notes on the state we've tacked on at the end, because this is a video mostly about verb forms, and we recently covered the stative, so it feels appropriate to put it here. So, before we start talking about how to do negations grammatically, we need to know how to recognize them. And every single word for no or not, at least all the ones we're going to learn about, other than a couple of auxiliary verbs not covered here, shares in common this symbol that you see on the top left of the screen, the negative arms. It represents a person holding their arms out, elbows near the waist, and palms up. I could not tell you with certainty whether this is part or all of the Egyptian way of saying no, although I do know that if I were to write English in hieroglyphics and design a whole system around it, the word for no would include someone's head to the side to represent, shaking your head. So probably, if I had to take a wild guess, the Egyptians said no by doing something like putting their arms to their side, or by like crossing their arms in front of them or something where this gesture would be in some way involved. In any case, this is always found in the negation words that we are going to be learning about today. Phonetically, it has the value n. You'll note it actually does look quite a bit like the letter n. This is a problem that is even worse in hieratic, the Egyptian cursive. It is very easy to make a spelling error between the negative arms and the regular letter n, and it happened quite a bit. So that occasionally you'll see that as an error in printed hieroglyphic texts as well that have been transcribed over from hieratic. In general, you're going to find that it ends up working quite a lot like you or mech as a particle. That's fundamentally its role. Occasionally it does different stuff, but it's basically a particle like you or mech, but with the basic meaning of no or not or without. And before we move on, also, there are negative auxiliary verbs. We're not going to cover them. We might, if we end up covering the whole book, talk about them, but they're quite late, and they're much less common than the negative arms, so we're going to focus our attention on those. Simplest kind of sentence to deal with is, of course, a non-verbal sentence. U, X, Y is Y modifying X. This is one of the first things that we learned, the first kind of sentence that we studied. U, E, im is I am there. There are exactly two differences with a nonverbal negated sentence and a nonverbal regular sentence. In a nonverbal negated sentence, first of all, instead of you use nen, so negative arms with another n below it. And also, instead of using the suffix pronoun attached to the start of the sentence, the you just use the dependent pronoun cycle. So instead of it is we, etc. Otherwise, exactly the same functioning, and the meaning is the opposite. Very simple. There's another kind of sentence we need to talk about briefly before we can really get into negating it. That is an existential sentence, which is a scary sounding word that just means a sentence saying that something exists. There is X, or there are X. There are two methods, either a nonverbal sentence, as we would kind of expect for something containing is. Usually it contains the particle im, meaning there, just as a sort of existential qualifier, or using the verb wenen. Occasionally it's introduced with a particle we haven't met before, iset or isech, the common spelling mistake in Egyptian where they can't decide whether or they want a t or a ch sound, which has the basic meaning of now, although really you can just kind of translate it with a there is. Quick example, iset when chametef merit renes. Iset, as we just discussed, that's our particle meaning now. And we also have when. So we can absolutely tell this is an existential sentence. So the first part is just there is. You can even say now there is, then there is, but there is chametef, his wife. So better way to translate, perhaps, there was his wife, or even he had a wife, or something like that. Merit renes. Merit, her name was Merit. Pretty standard nonverbal sentence in the second part. Not terribly complicated grammatically, as you would expect from a sentence just saying that something exists. These tend to be quite simple declarations of fact. It will not be hard for you to parse them. You can, of course, negate existential sentences. If something can exist, it could also not exist. You just use the same structure, except instead of iset or you use nen, and the when is largely mandatory. You can use just nen with the nonverbal sentence negation, but nen when is also quite common. So here's an example. Nen when pehuifi. Pehuifi being the we-fi construction of possession. Nen when there is not. Pech here is being translated as end, and then the we-fi, there is no end of it or to it. It is endless. Again, not terribly complicated grammatically. You can also just negate a noun for when you don't have something, or there's a lack of something or whatever. Usually, this is best translated as without, forming a prepositional phrase. Usually, it functions basically prepositionally here. Like I said, nen is not always a particle, even though it mostly is. And it's very simple, just nen plus the noun. Men menetu iri nen jeru. Men menet is the wonderful sounding word for cattle, plural, with the u. So cattle, iri, there. Nen jeru, there's our negation. So jeru means limits. Nen jeru then means without limit, endlessly. This is not a sentence. This is just a fragment of a sentence. It's describing some conquests. And part of the conquest is their cattle without limit. You just take all of the cows. Remember that infinitives are also nouns, which means that they can be negated just like nouns. And in fact, the parallel is even better than that, because you can also negate them just with the word without. Not terribly dissimilar from the nouns, really. So here is an example of that. Nen redit rec set mesha f. That last, like the soldier thing, is mesha, or meshao f, I guess, really, because a slightly incorrect transcription. Nen redit would be without allowing. Redit being the infinitive, and then nen, so he's not letting them. Redit rec, remember, generally means to let know, to inform. So taking that kind of all together, without informing, set it, and then mesha f, his soldiers. Putting all of that together without informing his soldiers of it, or without letting his soldiers know it. And then we have the negative verb, which is the slightly more complicated part of negations. See, the negative verb is slightly different from the circumstantial. They're similar, they're not quite the same, for reasons that kind of go back to Old Egyptian and the way that verbs worked there. I don't fully understand how it kind of alludes to it. They're similar, but they do kind of have their own rules in addition to just being the opposite meaning. The big difference is that the second geminate verbs do not geminate. So kebeb becomes keb, for example. Otherwise, everything is basically the same. Apparently, occasionally, you'll see it a ton, third week verbs take on a Y ending instead of an I ending. That's not a huge difference. You probably won't notice it. Otherwise, pretty standard. Now, every single negative verb, rather than taking nen, takes n. If you see a verb and you see nen in front of it, you're probably dealing with an infinitive, actually, because of the nen takes nouns and n takes verbs. Infinitive is the noun form, so nen with those, but n with a truly verbal form, or I guess adverbial form, really, n. The past form uses segem f rather than segem nf. This is, as you will remember, much like the passive of the circumstantial, where the rules are kind of flipped with which one gets the n and which one just has the dictionary form. A particular use that comes up a good bit, rec means did not know, and also do not know. It's kind of an exception in that case. It's kind of both past and present using the past active. Otherwise, translate in general with he did not hear for main clauses, and then for circumstantial subordinate clauses, he not having heard, although he did not hear, etc., because he did not hear, that, all that fun stuff. So here we have a quick example. Here's a good example of that spelling error I mentioned earlier, which is that I myself put in the wrong form of n. It is a very easy mistake to make because they look so similar if you only gloss over it. But that is supposed to be negative arms n. So n with the arms. Sejdwi chem en heri tep f. So sejdwi means to slander. Not a common verb, but certainly a fun one. Also with a very interesting writing. I'm not sure if I transcribe if Hoke transcribed it wrong or if this is genuinely how the word is spelled, but the Y comes before the W, even though the word is pronounced the other way around. So Sedgwick is to slander, Sedgwick I slandered, or I slander, but with the N, it flips both the negative and the tense. So it becomes, rather than I am slandering, I slander, sounds like the nationality now that I think about it, it instead becomes I did not slander. Chem, that's not chem-e, that's chem, with the man determinative, so we know that this means servant. N peri tep f, to his master. This is, I believe, is part of the negative confessions. A lot of negations in there. It's a section of the Book of the Dead where the man says all the stuff that he didn't do wrong. And one of the things he didn't do is talk bad about a guy's servants to him to make him mad at his servants. That would be a very mean thing to do. There is also, as we would expect, a passive form of the negative verb. Not terribly different from the active form. It just uses the to form to make it passive. That's basically all. Instead of he did not hear, it becomes like he was not heard or something like that. Just the passive version of the verb. Same difference. Now for another one that's a little different is the present active, which does have the N unlike the past form. It can either mean cannot hear or does not hear. Each of those are perfectly appropriate with this form. The verb itself, identical to the Sedgwick forms. This is just going to look like your regular bog standard verb, like circumstantial, except it's negated. So here, introduced with the correct particle this time, we have a quick negated sentence. En rdi en ek, which looks like the past, but again, we have an N introducing it, not a U or some other equivalent, so it is in fact the past time. Ni debau en medet ten nefret. En rdi en ek. So rdi en ek would be you gave, among other meanings, but here we're going to take gave because it will make more sense with the rest of the sentence. But with the N, it flips it to you do not give any to me, although this is a dative, so we can, in English, just take the me. You do not give me debau, compensation, payment, and medit ten nefret, for this fine speech, with that Egyptian adjective ordering, flipping things around on the English word order. This, I'm almost certain, comes from the story The Eloquent Peasant. Hoke does cite it as Eloquent Peasant. Basically, this guy keeps on pleading his legal case and they keep ignoring him. So now he's saying, well, I have said all these fine things, but you do not repay me. You don't actually listen to what I'm saying and give me what I want, is pretty much what is being said here. There is, of course, also a passive form of the present. Same as the regular present active, to marker inserted after the N. No other differences, very simple, does not require an example. Then we have the future negation. This one also takes nen, because once again, we are not dealing with a verb. We are dealing with a nominal form of a verb, a perspective. It is another one that I think is quite simple. You can even make it passive with a to particle. In general, it is just nen plus a perspective clause, and then you were saying that something will not happen, that you will prevent something from happening or whatever. Yeah, again, it's just a perspective clause with which you should already be quite familiar, with nen in front of it, and it means this will not happen, rather than the perspective of wanting something to happen. Seems like the logical continuation. You can also have a form with nen adjective. If nen is followed by an adjective, it generally means that this adjective will not occur to the following noun. Then sheri ren is the example given. Sheri meaning to lessen. So then that translates to a man's name will not be lessened. Or really, a name will not be lessened. Nen sheri ren ns. A man's name will not be lessened. Another interesting form of the negation is en sep. Sep is a word that we have already seen in a number of concepts. Usually it means like time, generally in the sense conveyed by the German mal and other, like, this is the first time I've done this, is sep. We've also seen it to repeat characters. Here, with an n, a negation, you can think of it as at no time. En sep plus a perspective means at no time did this happen. En sep sejemev, he was never heard. Or, well, he never heard. A quick example for that. So our start is the en sep, and then ha'i mit f cher chaset ten jer rek necher. En sep, it has not happened. Ha'i means to come down. And then our subject is mit f. Very interesting thing. Mi is a comparison verb, or comparison conjunction, really, meaning like. But meet makes a noun out of that, and then putting the f on it, you get this kind of idiomatic like it, something like it. So ha'i meet f, something like it comes down. But then en sep ha'i meet f, something like it had not come down. Her, which is here taken as since. Chaset ten jer rek necher. Oh, my apologies. I translated the wrong. All right. Her chaset is from the desert. That makes a little bit more sense. Ten, this desert, really. Jer rek necher. Since the time rek of the god, necher. So one like it had not come down from this desert since the time of the god. And then just a couple of quick notes on the stative. Occasionally, you can get the first person singular stative appearing alone, pretending to be a main clause. Red kui, meaning I was put, perfectly acceptable, Egyptian. Doesn't happen a ton, but it does come up. Thing to pay attention to. You're not reading it wrong. That is an allowable sentence. You can also have a stative just kind of hanging out on its own in the second or third person, and there it has a particular meaning. It is an exclamation. If you have learned much Egyptian before this, and even hung around in any online Egyptian kind of spaces, you are probably familiar with the phrase Anku Leju Senebu, or some variant thereof, because the difficulties in translating Egyptian make it difficult to say what the original pronunciation was, and you'll see people fill this out in various ways. But the meaning is life, prosperity, health. I sometimes like to tongue-in-cheekly translate it as live long and prosper because it's the same meaning. But it's a series of exclamations. May you live. May you have prosperity. May you have health. There's a number of similar things. You'll find them a lot on monuments. Anhu Jet, may you live forever, or may he live forever. All very common Egyptianisms. You will see them a lot. It shows up in a few other ways. Basically, if you see a stative hanging around with no obvious purpose in like a brief sentence, that's an exclamation. And it's like, may you or may he, Ankti, may you live. Anku, may he live, etc. All right, that is all we have for today on negations and also a little bit of stative stuff there at the end. The next lecture, we are going to get into a very fun, and by fun, I of course mean horribly complicated form of the verb, the participle.